Okay, boy, get the ball. Welcome. Come in. Don't be scared. At least, not yet. That's my hellhound, Ketchum. We're just playing a little game of fetch. Come here. Bring the ball. What's this? I said the ball, not a human skull. You know what they say? You can't teach an old dog new tricks. Unlike tonight's rabbit report. A family is mourning the loss of their pet when they decide to take the old dog to a taxidermist for preservation. Except this taxidermist has a different preservation in mind. Gather around. Look into the light. Look. Look deep. Open your imagination and listen to the story called Here, Boy.
I'll miss you, boy.
She looked down at the dog, which lay stretched out on the porch. The warm tears on her cheek reminded her of the slobbery kiss she'd gotten just this morning. Now, some 3 hours later, it lay dead in its favorite spot on the porch. The spot where the sun was the brightest and warmest each morning. Thumper was a black golden retriever with a white underbelly and chest. In many places on the body, the hair had started to gray and thin out, exposing the tender pink flesh underneath. The brindle around the dog's eyes and snout now gave the dog a rustic look. The short, curt tail lay motionless on the porch. The usually pointy wolf-like ears lay flat to the ground. They had rescued Thumper from a pound when the pup was just 6 months old. Jane was only 3 at the time. For the next 11 years, she and the dog were inseparable, as she lavished love and affection on the dog that had been so badly mistreated previously. They hadn't named him right away, but the short, sharp thumps of the tail on the wooden floor each morning made Thumper an easy choice. For 11 years, Jane would wake up to sloppy kisses as the dog rose from its ever-present spot at the end of her bed. They would take long walks in the fields behind their house. They'd play ball in the backyard. And when it rained, they'd snuggle under blankets and watch TV together, trading bite for bite of whatever Jane was eating. Thumper was her best friend, and now he was gone.
Mom, can I go over to Michaela's for a while, please?
It was the second week of summer break, and Jane couldn't stand the silence of the house, the lack of nails on laminate. She didn't know if she'd ever get used to it.
Sure, hon. Just be back for curfew, okay? Unless Michaela's mom can't feed you, then you come home at 6 for dinner.
She looked down at Thumper's body, lying motionless on the porch, the sun reflecting off the multicolored fur.
Okay. Maybe in a minute,
She said, going down onto her stomach so that she could be nose to nose with the dog. The tears now trickled down both her cheeks. Jane's parents didn't broach the subject with their daughter. They wanted it to be a surprise. As Haley loaded the dog into the back of the SUV that same lunchtime, she hoped that they were doing the right thing. She had called her husband at the office just after her daughter had gone, shoulders low and still, stifling occasional sobs, over to her best friend's house. She had to admit that she was ever so slightly freaked out by the idea of taxidermists, but she was willing to ask the questions at least.
Hello?
She called into the dim alcove of the basement, which was sparsely lit by a series of exposed light bulbs dangling freely. Some of them had blown, the light now patchy. The sign above the small entrance read, Irwin's taxidermist. Don't bury 'em, stuff 'em. She thought that was a little crude, but this was the only place listed within a 50-mile radius. A mounted tiger, baring teeth in that frightening grin, greeted her as she walked in. Along the right side of the wall were a range of mounted animal heads, a lion, a deer, what looked like an elk, and a series of other animals that she couldn't quite place. On the left side of this isn't a shop, she thought. Well, on the left side was a large work desk, complete with a dead chicken laying on top, partially skinned, the blood dripping slowly onto the floor, the splats amplified in the eerie silence of the basement.
Help you?
You scared me.
She said, holding her right hand over her chest. The left instinctively clutched her purse as tightly as she could. Ambling from a hidden office was a short, bespectacled man with graying hair. He walked as if he had a crooked back, and came dressed in overalls that were splattered red with blood that she caught a whiff of in her nostrils.
I usually do smell like this. It ain't pretty what I do. I apologize for the smell, missus. I just gutted that chicken. Filthy business. Can I help you?
Our dog died today.
And you want me to stuff it?
I guess so, yeah.
He wiped his hands down the front of the overalls, adding to the red that covered the front. She was scared of this man, scared of this place, scared of the smell of chicken's blood that now filled her nostrils.
Well, let's see the mutt. I'll do it. Tell you what, I used to have a dog exactly like this, called Lennox. That little fucker got run down by a truck chasing a ball I threw a little too hard.
I'm sorry.
Sorry don't mean shit, missus. I am sorry I swore. But I threw that damn ball, it was my fault. I never forgave myself. That's why I got into this damn business. I couldn't bring Lennox back, but after I got into this line of work, the kids just seem to light up when they see their little friends come back to life, so to speak. I'll work on this dog for free.
You don't have...
I said I'll do it for free. I'll need a few days, maybe 5. Is that okay?
Okay.
Is this for your son?
No, my daughter. This was her dog. His name is Thumper.
Nice name. Listen, you know where I am. What day is today?
Wednesday.
Come back Tuesday next week, okay? Old Lennox here will be ready to go, good as new.
Thumper.
I'd shake your hand, but I can't, so I shan't. I'll see you next Tuesday, missus.
With that, he was going down the steps to his den again. The family pet that had eaten her cushions and stolen defrosting steaks off the side, slung over his shoulder. With the clatter of the door to the modest little shop front, he was gone. He paused to lock the door and draw the drapes. Haley stood there in silence, not totally sure what to make of that exchange, still smelling the blood in her nostrils. She never wanted to set foot into that dark, dank, and scary basement ever again. He swept the table with his free hand, sending all the instruments on top to the floor with a clatter. The chicken's body landed with a moist plop. He kicked it under the table. He laid the dog down on its side and pulled up a stool to the edge of his work desk. He'd waited so long for this chance. He rested his head on the edge of the table, looking down onto the dusty workshop floor. He closed his eyes in an attempt to blink away the tears. He was 15 when Lennox was run over and killed. They were playing on the front lawn of their house in Aldwater in eastern Texas. They'd recently downsized due to the fact that his father had lost his job. The money from his redundancy was rapidly running out. Mom was working all the hours she could find, while his father lined up day after day in the job centers, filling in forms and then coming home to wait for the phone to never ring. It was a little over 6 weeks after they'd moved that the drinking started. His daddy slipping into a deep depression of which he never came out of. Then the arguing started. Then the fights came. Then his mother started coming down to breakfast with bruises on her arms, her face. She grimaced when she ate or sat down for too long. That's how it went on, until Daddy put his shotgun in his own mouth one morning and pulled the trigger. Funny thing was that the phone rang 2 days after. Daddy had got a job offer. Lennox was Irwin's best friend, the brother he'd never have. Moving schools was hard, leaving all of his friends behind. Making new ones came very difficult for him. Coming home to Lennox was a godsend. Each and every single day, the dog would be waiting behind the porch door, bright-eyed and tail wagging. They were playing fetch on the front lawn that morning when Irwin bounced the ball toward the dog. Lennox nudged it in midair with his nose, and it sprang over the low fence and into the street. The dog was lean and athletic and cleared the fence no problem. The post truck came from the dog's blind side, sending him 30 yards down the road with a bone-crunching snap. He sat and cried on that front lawn all morning until his mom came home and wrestled the dog's body off of him, despite his protests. She threw the dog's rotting carcass into the garbage can like it was Sunday's leftover meatloaf. He hated her from that minute onwards. The old garage stood at the side of the house, connected by a small door to the main house. There long hadn't been a car in the garage as they'd sold it so that they could pay for his father's funeral. The work table had been dragged into the center of the room, and now served as the focal point of their junk collection. He swept the table clear of its contents, knocking cartons of milk to the floor along with old housekeeping magazines and some of his father's old clothes that he would supposedly grow into. He lugged Lennox's body onto the table and flipped the dog onto its back. The incision was perfect. He'd used a scalpel recently on a frog in science class.
I'm sorry, boy.
He threw the guts into the garbage can he'd brought in. The trash collection was due in a few hours, so he needed to work fast. Lennox's heart came out with spurts of blood that decorated his pajamas. It dropped into the jar with a splash, the ethyl alcohol that his father used during his short stint as a wannabe brewer, acting as a preserver. Next he set about the eyes, the blood spilling out of the dog, slowly trickling off the table and onto the floor. He made a mental note to clean up before his mom came home from her early morning shift at Baker's strip joint. Chances were that she'd be too bugged out to notice, but he wasn't willing to take the chance. When everything was done, and the garage once again resembled a thrift shop, the body went out to the curb, buried by a pile of trash. Everything once again looked normal. The dog's heart and eyes were safely tucked away under his bed. He threw the stool away, racing towards the dark depths of the basement, seeking out the 2 jars that he had kept for this occasion, which had been so long in coming. Now that it was here, he was shaking excitedly. He was nervous, but he was determined. By the time that bitch came back for her dog, they'd both be gone. A career as a taxidermist appealed to him instantly after he'd performed his little salvage operation on Lennox. At 15, he'd have to wait a while and worked a series of uninspiring jobs and finish school satisfactorily, moving into his own place on his 18th birthday. He was surprised at how easy a taxidermy program was to both find and complete. He took up a full-time admin job at the local car dealership to pay for the costs of the 3-year part-time program. The process of obtaining his state license and federal permit took another 4, and finally, at the tender age of 25, Irwin Joyce was a certified member of the National Taxidermist Association. His portfolio of clients grew steadily wherever he chose to lay his hat. After leaving his 1-bedroom apartment in downtown Aldwater, he lived something of a vagabond life and regularly traveled to different states, rebuilding the clientele and making enough money to live a comfortable and easy life before moving on again. It was fate that brought him to Ogden. Irwin was well into the third day of the process when he removed the heart from the jar of alcohol, the musty smell instantly assaulting his nostrils. The other dog's heart lay at the bottom of the trash, as did its eyes. The skin was well prepared for the final stage, which is called the dressing. He placed the heart in the vacant swell of the chest and closed up the wound, repeating the process with the eyes. He took the treated skin off the chair beside him and set about sewing up the coat onto the body, the delicate final step of bringing his best friend back from the dead. It was nearly sundown on Saturday when he had finished. He stood breathless, gazing down at Lennox, who now stood on the reinforced legs, his big eyes looking out proudly over the workshop. Irwin blinked back the tears again as he looked down at his work. All he could do now was set the wheels in motion for their imminent departure on Monday. When What's-Her-Name came back on Tuesday, she'd find the shop closed and abandoned, the basement workshop vacant. Irwin Joyce would be gone. His faithful pet sat proudly on the passenger seat alongside him. Together, they'd live the life he'd always dreamt of back in Aldwater, where he still held the deeds to the house where he'd last lived with his mother. He'd need to inform the owner of the premises first thing on Monday, and they'd be on their way by sundown on Monday. Right now, though, it was Saturday night, and Irwin needed a drink. He stroked the dog on the head, running his hand down the stiff spine of the cadaver.
It's good to see you again, boy.
He locked the door to the workshop, heading for the little flat perched above the main shop to shower and change. Tonight, he was celebrating. The breaking of glass down in the basement woke him from his drunken slumber. He immediately regretted jerking awake, as the headache hit him like a sledgehammer to the side of the head. He didn't know how much he had drunk, but he was fully dressed and asleep on the floor of the sparse living room, and he could smell vomit. It had been a while since he had gotten good and drunk. He was starting to vaguely remember the night when he heard a bark from the basement. He fumbled with the locks and sprinted down the stairs, ignoring the pain in his temple. He swept through the basement door breathlessly, his eyes still adjusting to the darkness around him. His right foot hit the shards of glass on the floor, just inside the arch of the door.
Son of a bitch!
He cried, hopping onto his good foot over to the light switch, which he threw on. The lights clicked on, slowly warming up and bringing light to patches of the basement. His foot throbbed as he held it in his left hand. He held the sole of it up to the light. There were shards sitting lopsidedly out of his foot. Blood flowed down into his palm, slipping through his fingers. Empty jars must have fallen off the table and smashed. Something clicked in his mind. All of a sudden, the haziness of the alcohol washed away. The dog wasn't on the table. It now lay bare. Had he really heard a bark upstairs? He couldn't see into the dim of the back of the workshop. One of the features of the basement was that it sloped. A design fault in the building meant that you could just about duck under the roof at the end of the basement. He had nothing there, and hadn't bothered rigging his series of lights further than 3/4 of the way down to the room. The uneasy feeling drove through him again, mixed with the alcohol resonating in his stomach. He was fucking scared. He had a gun upstairs, but he doubted his own ability to make it back up there with his foot the way it was. He stared at the empty table, wondering where Lennox was. His head swirled even more, forcing him to drop his foot and reach out to the work table for stability. He yelped as the foot hit the floor, driving the shards in further. He looked down at the floor for a few seconds, enough time to regain his composure and wait for the feeling of wooziness to pass.
Lennox? Lennox. Here, boy.
He backed slowly around the table, feeling behind him for the office door, which he all but fell in sight of. The flashlight was in a box under the footspace of the desk. His eyes never left the doorway. He rooted and eventually his hand fell on the flashlight. He turned it on momentarily, blinding himself before turning it back out of the door. He pushed himself up and peered around the door, shining the torch around the corner. The growling was still low, but audible, and fucking frightening. Irwin shined the light into the depths of the basement. The beam hit the dog's eyes first. They were bloodshot and red, and opened as wide as they possibly could be. The dog stood on its legs, its snout open in a snarl. It stared directly at the light, not even blinking or attempting to shield itself from the brightness. The dog slowly started to edge toward Irwin, who could hear the stitching crackling as the joints loosened up again. The tail didn't wag. This dog didn't want to play. Irwin was backing away from the advancing dog.
You killed me. I didn't, boy. It was an accident. I loved you. You threw the ball into the road. No, it was an accident. Why did you let the bitch cunt of a mother throw me in the garbage? I didn't. I got you. I saved you. You threw me away. I loved you, boy. You killed me.
The dog was nearly upon Irwin now, who had backed up as far as he could, and now stood transfixed.
I didn't mean to. I'm not your dog anymore.
The teeth bit down into Irwin's neck, immediately sending blood spurting across the basement. He began to make gurgling sounds as the blood flowed from his neck. The dog kept biting down, opening fresh wounds. After the neck was fully exposed, the dog went north and bit through the nose, the crunching sound of breaking bone making Irwin vomit through the hole in his neck. The mixture of blood and sick joining the blood and flowing down the front of his shirt. The dog bit into both cheeks and tore off one of his ears before Irwin had bled to death. The dog backed up, panting, getting its breath back. It then strolled back to the depths of the basement and curled up to sleep.
Mom, it's Thumper!
Busy washing up their breakfast dishes, she had just sent Jane to get the paper and the mail. She was now bouncing excitedly up and down on the spot, pointing at her dog, who sat on the porch, mouth open and tongue lolled out comically. The tail didn't wag, and there was no movement in the dog's side. It was Thumper, all right. But how had the taxidermist known where to bring it, she thought, watching her daughter bend down to hug the dog.
man's best friend. Too bad the feeling wasn't mutual. In the end, Irwin did stuff Thumper. Fool of himself, that is. Ketchum didn't want to play fetch anymore, so we're now playing a new game. It's his favorite. I even named it after him. Is the volunteer in the courtyard? Good. Ready, set, Ketchum. I hope you enjoyed tonight's tale. Until the next one, won't you stay the night